Hi, I'm Shriya, and welcome to Casting the Net, a youth-led series hosted by teens for teens, exploring the breadth and depth of our online worlds. In each episode, we cast the net wide to learn about the opportunities and challenges the internet brings and to hear from experts from around the globe. In this episode, we're going to be exploring a topic that has been getting a lot of attention lately, the Manosphere. In the last few years, we have seen the rise in popularity of divisive influencers such as Andrew Tate, sparking debate and controversy around masculinity, relationships, and gender dynamics. But how might this affect teenagers, and what are the consequences? To learn more, and to get advice for teens, I'm delighted to be joined by child and adolescent psychoanalytical psychotherapist Dr. Colman Noctor. Thanks for joining me, Colman.
Thanks, Shriya. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Firstly, what exactly is the Manosphere, and what do you think is the driving force behind the rise in popularity?
Well, I think the Manosphere, by description, is a kind of a group or a movement of influencers, I suppose, online influencers who kind of promote rigid gender roles. So, I suppose the idea of misogyny, which is the idea that maybe men have more power over women, and harking back to a time where there was a very dominant male society. Females around that time perhaps didn't have much of a voice, didn't have much of a say, certainly weren't paid the same, weren't given equal rights, etc. And there's an idea around kind of a return to that, I suppose, way of seeing the world, or the way in which society is structured. But in terms of its influence, it's kind of closeted in this idea of, it starts out perhaps around motivation and focus and fast cars and big muscles and how to be successful, how to be successful with women, and there's these images of these influencers with their fast cars and their wonderful lifestyles, and they're kind of, I suppose, promoting a way of life that is male dominant, and to many probably is, I think teenagers view it with a degree of dismissiveness, but to perhaps one or two, maybe those who are struggling with low self-esteem and low self-worth, this idea of this way of life or this way of seeing the world is attractive. And the Manosphere itself has gotten a lot of traction. So there's a lot of followers out there. You mentioned Andrew Tate. He was probably one of the starters of this kind of movement, and certainly the most formidable, and he was arrested, and there was a bit of high profileness to that. But he's certainly not on his own. The reason, and I think this is an important thing, I think over the last perhaps while, we have talked a lot around gender in terms of the fluidity of gender, that things aren't non-binary, that and we're looking at gender in a different way. And I think that's as a society as a whole. There's questions around that. And when you see a rise in one narrative, you will always see a counter rise in the other, to almost, to counter it, or to kind of go against it. And for those who perhaps don't want to see the world kind of in a very non-binary way, or they like things to be a little bit more clear or more concrete, they will try and challenge that narrative. And what happens is, an extreme view on one side will mean an extreme view on the other. And we've seen that for decades. This is not new. With any sort of propaganda of any sort of new way of being or new way of living or seeing the world, there will always be a counter push against that. So the more we try to be inclusive and diverse, the more people will perhaps become more rigid and more insular. And like, it's a wider discussion about migrants, around the issues around social class, the issues around gender. There will always be a left and a right debate. And as the left gets stronger, the right gets stronger, and if the right gets stronger, the left gets stronger. And so we have this dynamic at play at the moment. But so the manosphere very much would be, in my view, a rise of a narrative to perhaps counter one that is about diversity, inclusivity, and progression. And it perhaps sounds like harking back to a time that is long gone. But it's it's not as obvious as it sounds. It is lots of people might be attracted into it with the motivational speeches around, you can be anything you want to be, and you need to be motivated, and you need to work hard, and you need to do that. And then it's that sort of motivational stuff is cloaks the kind of more sinister messages around domination, misogyny, and other perhaps deemed inappropriate stuff that they would talk about. But yeah, so that's what it is, and why I believe it perhaps has risen to popularity in recent times.
Would you say the rise in popularity for this is especially amongst teenage boys?
No, I mean, I think teenage boys are certainly the likely cohort to be influenced by it, because there's a kind of a there's a there's a an interesting. I listened to Jimmy Carr. He was on an interview on a podcast called The Diary of the CEO, and he said almost like Donald Trump is like a poor man's idea of a rich man. It's kind of gold taps and that sort of stuff. And I suppose to a teenage boy, Andrew Tate is almost the image of masculinity, fast cars and big muscles. So it's it's a caricature of what
Mm.
masculinity is. And so more vulnerable people who maybe haven't a good idea of what masculinity actually looks like might be seduced into that, from that
Mm.
point of view. But it's interesting because I suppose young males are also, young adult males are very much influenced by this, but also this is not a timeless issue. It's not an age issue. But I suppose our concerns are more for younger people who are more impressionable. But if we look out through history, radicalization, if you want to radicalize any group of people, you almost tell them about that they're being disenfranchised. So if you're a kid is 16 years of age and you've got acne and you're not really good at girls and you're struggling with your life and you're struggling with your self-esteem and self-worth, these guys almost come and say, we have the antidote to that. You can be different, and women are keeping you down and they're taking your jobs and demasculating us, and men in the 40s and 50s were real men, and we need to go back to that. And if you're a well-adjusted adult, you might go, that's nonsense. But maybe if you're not and you haven't had those experiences and you're dealing with your own stuff, you might be more vulnerable to being radicalized by that message, and think that there's something in it. So yeah, teenage boys are particularly at risk of this, but
Mhm.
basically because of their impressionability. That would be, I think that's maybe um, why we're kind of targeting that cohort as somebody who needs support around this.
Coleman, why do you think views like this get the most amount of traction? And are younger people more likely to buy into them?
The internet's an interesting space because what is popular is more powerful than what is true, right? So
Mm.
if you want something to gain traction, it is about creating popularity. It's not about creating evidence. So I can produce all the science and the graphs and the evidence. It's that may not get shared, but and what is popular is oftentimes what is extreme. So when you're looking for something, you're looking for the sensational, or the something that's captivating, or the something that's outside of the ordinary. So it's the extraordinary. And so if you want a view to travel around the world, it has to be on the extreme end of things in order for it to capture people's attention. So I could do a TikTok video on how moderation is important and we need to keep things in the middle and not go to the extremes of things, which might be the right way to address our mental health needs, but it won't get any traction because nobody finds that interesting. That's that's truth. That's not popularity. So the more extreme my message is, and this is where these messages get mixed up, because it might start off about motivation, and it might be starting about focus, and it might be starting about kind of alpha maleism, and then it goes into misogyny and domination and all of these things in order to get that traction. So if you and I were in an argument, right, and we had a
Mm.
disagreement, and I was coming to the disagreement at point 4 in 1 to 10, and you were at 6, in order for me to make my point, I might have to go to 3. And then, in order to make your point, you might go to 7. Then I'll go
Mm.
to 2, and you'll go to 8. And before we know it, we're at 1 and 10. We didn't start
Mm.
out that way, but in order to hammer home our points, we need to
Yeah.
become, and sometimes we end up in arguments about things coming across far more passionate than we ever started out to be. But the argument to go over and back causes us to do that. So that's how polarization happens. And that's how the left and right debate happens. That, well, we'll suggest this, well, we'll suggest that, you know, a more firmer position or a more extreme position, and you end up with these polar opposites. And in the online world, what is extreme is what is shareable, and what is
Mm.
popular is what is valuable. So, yes, that's why the worrying around that platform is that it shares what's popular and doesn't share what's true. Yeah.
Mm. Would you say like easy content creation that's like available to anyone today is like a really big driving force into like young people actually getting into the range of viewing such content and personalized content creation by big tech companies is a big thing that would
Yeah,
be.
yeah, I think it would be, but I think the game changer in all of this was when we moved from being consumers of content to
Mm.
producers of content, right? So
Yeah.
around 2009, 10, we were given this right to produce our own contents. And then everyone had journalism capabilities. We could have a one-to-many capacity
Mm.
to content. And when we became producers of media, it gave us free reign to produce whatever media we wanted. It didn't have to
Yeah.
be it didn't have to be fact checked. It didn't have to be vetted for suitability. And that changed everything because once we became producers of media, then everyone had a voice. Well, that's a good thing in many ways, and the one to many is very, very good. Its potential for spreading harm is greater. So yes, I think the idea of easy content creation has changed everything.
Mm.
Because we no longer rely on things like the 6 o'clock news for our
Yeah.
in actual fact, most people don't. We get our news from TikTok and whatever that might be. And some of it might be very useful, but some of it might be misinformed nonsense.
Mm.
But there's no way of distinguishing between the two. And that's what's scary about it. And recently, a group of teenagers were interviewed about this, and they would say, they'd see content, and then they'd find out whether the content was true or not through the comments. So they'd read
Mm.
the comments and see. Um, but again, that's citizen journalism as well. There's
It's,
no need for the comments may not be
yeah.
in any way accurate.
Truthful.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
yes, being consumers of media has muddied the truth and has I would say the toothpaste is out of the tube at this stage. It's impossible to get that back.
Mm. How can you talk to someone who is drawn to extremist influencers? So if they were like absolutely into it and they have that kind of ideology, I suppose.
I think there's the first thing to do is what not to do is to rubbish it, dismiss it, and attack it. Because remember, I said to you, the more under attack I become, the more entrenched in my belief I will, and I may need to defend it more. But it's about asking them about it because all of the belief system is built on this very superficial set of beliefs. If I'm dominant towards women, I will end up having a fast car, and if I train in the gym, I will become, sought after from the world's point of view. The reality is that most jobs don't look for your car or your muscles; they look for your experience, your ability, and so by having a conversation and tell me what the appeal is, pitch this to me, recruit me. And when they try and do that, there'll be a series of superficial things that they will claim for it to be. Um, and it's very easy to gently pick holes in that
Mm.
and ask alternatives because once you're in that kind of echo chamber of the manosphere, it's all just endorsing this. Nobody's kind of saying, well, and there's a big thing around, I suppose, uh, these guys are saying school is rubbish, formal education is not important. I got where I am before this and all that. So if you're starting to believe that, you'll become more dismissive of the value of education and school and all of these things. So a gentle reminder that in actual fact, education is important. In actual fact,
Mm,
it's essential. And in actual fact, while these guys might be saying to you, this is my recipe for success, how often does that work?
mm,
And it's the same, but the parents would say to me, I'm going to really push my kid to be good at this sport because I've seen Tiger Woods' dad or Venus Williams' dad or Andrew Agassi's dad. They did this and they became successful athletes. And I'm saying, well, you're not seeing the other thousands of parents who have no relationship with their child because they push them to be good at a sport or be good at music or whatever. So you're only seeing that 1%. And there's
mm,
99% of these things don't work. And it is about kind of gently introducing that into this discussion as well. That, okay, muscles, domination, and a fast car got this guy where he is. There's no guarantee that it's going to get you there.
mm,
You need a plan B. Um, but it's not by dismissing it and attacking it, because I think that further entrenches people's belief that they're
mm,
right, that everyone's out. Because that's what the Manosphere says. It says women are trying to emasculate you. They're going to take your jobs. We're going to be taken over. We're not going to have a voice
mm,
anymore. Nobody's listening to men anymore. We've become these kind of sissy boys, and we need to stand up to it. Um, and again, you want to be sure that you're not feeding into that belief system. You
mm.
know.
Would you say young people would get influenced by each other if one of them had an extremist belief or an extremist influence on them through their content feed on like different platforms?
Oh, for sure. I mean, again, I've worked with teenagers for 26 years now, and I've told them 100 pieces of advice that they've dismissed, and I've heard that same piece of advice being mentioned by a peer, of which it is received with the most amazing kind of, oh my God, what an epiphany,
Yeah.
So our peer group is our go-to in that age, and when we're in of that age, we've gone from it as you grow up, you think your parents are ideal. So I want to be like my dad, I want to be like my mom. And then at around 11 or 12, you realize, actually, I don't want to be like them. Who will I be like? And the next port of call is your peers. So
Yeah.
from 13 on till, I suppose, about 23, 24, the peer group is very powerful. And then you start to look to elders. So you get into the workplace and jobs and you see these guys and go, no, actually, I want to be like him or I want to be like her. And so it moves from the peers into into more kind of, I suppose,
Mm,
mentors, and that idea. And then hopefully you get to a point where people are then looking up to you and wanting to be like you. But yes, so in that period of kind of 12 to 22, our peer group are dominant in terms of our influences. So for sure, if our pals are thinking this way, there's a likelihood that we might be seduced into thinking that way too, for sure. Yeah.
mm. Sometimes online, the discussions is between people with very different or polarized opinions. Do people maybe feel like they must be on one side or the other?
Yes, 100%. And again, this is really a real problem in
Mm,
society, is that the middle voice is almost non-existent. And for me, the middle is the answer. The idea
yeah.
that you know, take for example, I may, and this might be an example that maybe is irrelevant to yourself, but let's say for example, I would all be all for equal rights in terms of sexuality and everything else, and I absolutely would be passionate about that. However, there's a debate going on last year about the famous song called "The Fairy Tale of New York," and should we
Mm,
change the lines in that to reflect that? While I might be passionate in agreement with this, I think that's maybe a step too far. Can we just not leave that the way that is, because that's a piece of history and that's important.
yeah.
Um, but there's a view that if you're not 100% with us, then you're against us. So
Yeah.
I can't voice that opinion because I will be lynched by the extremism saying, "Oh, well,
Mm,
then if you don't think that song should be changed, then you're homophobic." And that's
mm,
not necessarily. So rather than get involved in that debate of being attacked, I say nothing and I become the silent majority. And I believe most people live in that middle,
mm,
but are not in a position to. And I work at a third level university, and so we have debates around gender, pornography, whatever it might be, these things that are influencing society. And most of the people in that room are afraid to discuss it for fear of
mm,
causing offense. And I have this view and I have this belief, but I don't want to say it openly because I don't want to offend you or you or you. And
mm,
I feel paralyzed and immobilized by that. So I'm just going to sit and be
mm,
quiet. I'm just going to say nothing rather than say something and be attacked by it, you know.
mm,
And, you know, I've written columns a little bit in the past around the role of gender. And
mm,
I got attacked from both sides. People saying you're not coming down strong enough on the transgender issue. You're fudging it. And others playing, oh my God, you're not, you know, balanced enough to kind of see it. So both extremes attacked me for having a middle position.
yeah,
And that kind of sense of, well, you know, will I write another piece on that again? Probably not, you know, because
yeah,
that takes its toll. And that unfortunately means that the loud minorities are silencing the middle majority. And
mm,
that's what I really worry about for young people is that you become so hyper vigilant around causing offense that in actual
mm,
fact, you almost turn yourself in knots trying to
mm,
extract an opinion. So maybe let's not, you know, and if you only
yeah,
see that this extreme or this extreme is, I have to pick one of these sides, then you're more likely to join a side rather than maintain a
mm,
position in the middle. Um, and that idea of sitting on the fence is something that, you know, people are very critical of. Oh, you don't have vision or you don't have passion or you don't have,
mm,
well, maybe I do, but maybe it's a middle ground. Maybe I agree with some of what you're saying, but I don't agree about all of it. And I agree with
mm,
some of what you're saying, but I don't agree about all of it. That should be the ideal position to take, but it's
mm,
unfortunately the most undesired when it comes to
yeah,
popularity. So it's easier to be extreme than it is to be
mm.
moderate, and that's a real issue.
Join me in part 2, where I ask Colman about trends, the role of algorithms, and what advice he has for teenagers.